No one noticed the rain at first. In a place where water was rare, people trusted the ground beneath their feet without thinking twice. But one man did not. While the town slept, he dreamed of months of rain, of land giving way, of homes failing quietly in the dark. They called him foolish when he built on stone instead of soil. They laughed when he prepared for a storm that hadn't arrived. And when the water finally came, it did not ask who was ready. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Santa Fe was a hard place to live, even when nothing unusual happened. The land was dry, the ground pale and packed tight from years without steady rain. Houses sat low against the wind, built more for heat than for storms. People here trusted the weather because it had behaved the same way for a long time. Too much sun, too little water, that was the rule. On the morning this story began, the sky was clear, the air cool but already warming, and there was nothing to suggest that anything would change. Elias Crow woke before sunrise. He did not wake to noise. He woke because his body refused to stay still. He lay on his back for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the small rental room he had lived in for less than a year, and listened. There was no rain, no wind, only silence and the distant sound of a truck moving along the highway. Still, his chest felt tight, as if he had been running. The dream had followed him into waking. In it, he had been standing in the valley outside town. The land was the same, but the sky was not. It was covered completely by clouds, thick and unmoving. Rain fell straight down, steady and quiet. It did not storm. It did not stop. Days passed without change. The ground slowly darkened and softened. Water did not rush away. It stayed. It sank into the soil, into the spaces beneath houses and roads. Elias watched buildings begin to shift, not suddenly, not violently. They leaned. Walls cracked. Foundations failed without sound. People waited for the rain to end because that was what they believed rain always did. In the dream, Elias knew it would not. He did not know how long it would last, only that it would be long enough to matter. When he woke, the dream did not fade. Elias sat up and rubbed his face. He was 34 years old. He was tall, lean, and built by work rather than intention. His face was angular, with sharp cheekbones and a nose that had once been broken and never fully corrected. His eyes were gray-brown and usually unreadable. He kept his beard short. He didn't like excess. Old injuries made themselves known when he moved, especially his left shoulder, damaged years earlier on a construction site when a support beam slipped and pinned him briefly against a wall. The injury healed, but it left him cautious. He had learned that things failed quietly before they failed completely. He dressed, pulled on his boots, and made coffee on the small stove by the window. Outside, Santa Fe looked unchanged. The ground was dry, the sky was open, the air carried dust and sunlight. Everything appeared normal. It was just a dream, he said aloud. He did not believe it. Before becoming a cowboy, Elias had worked in construction. He had built houses, storage buildings, and small commercial structures across the Midwest. He knew how water moved. He knew what happened when soil stayed wet too long. He had seen foundations crack not because of storms, but because of patience. Water's patience, gravity's constant. Patience. When his father died, Elias left that work behind and took ranch jobs instead. Riding in isolation suited him better at the time, but the habits of a builder stayed with him. He still noticed slopes, he still noticed drainage, he still trusted what the ground told him more than what people assumed. By mid-morning, he was in town, walking with purpose. He went to Ortega Supply, the largest hardware store in the area. The building was old but well kept, and the shelves were stocked with the kind of materials people only bought when they planned to build something that needed to last. Sarah Ortega stood behind the counter. She was in her early 40s, tall and slim, with dark hair braided neatly down her back. Her skin was sun-darkened, her expression calm and direct. She had run the store for years and knew most people by name. She noticed details and remembered them. Elias had spoken to her before, but never at length. He brought his items to the counter. Drain pipe, waterproof sealant, flashing, heavy tar paper. Sarah looked at the stack, then at him. "Expecting rain?" she asked. "Eventually," Elias said. She scanned the items. You building in the valley? No? Good, she said. Valley soil doesn't hold up once it gets soaked. I know. She handed him the receipt. Where are you building? On the red hill. Sarah paused. That hill? That one. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Stone's better than dirt, she said. Just don't fight the wind. I won't. Elias loaded the supplies into his truck and drove past the edge of town, where pavement ended and the land opened. The red hill rose ahead of him, bare and exposed. People avoided it because it was inconvenient. There was no easy access to water, no shelter from wind, no soft ground for quick construction. Elias parked and climbed the rest of the way on foot. The wind was steady but manageable. The stone under his boots was solid. He stopped near the top and looked back at Santa Fe. From a distance, it looked stable. He knew that distance hid weaknesses. He knelt and placed his hand on the rock. It was warm, dry, and firm. Stone did not absorb water the way soil did. Stone did not shift easily. The dream returned, not as fear, but as confirmation. Elias stood and set his supplies down near a shallow recess in the rock face. It was not much, but it was enough to begin. He took out his measuring tape and notebook. The sky remained clear. The ground stayed dry. Still, he began planning for rain. Elias Crow returned to the Red Hill before sunrise the next morning, not because he was eager, but because early hours were honest. The wind had not yet gathered its full strength, and the stone still held the night's cool. He parked where the dirt track ended and led his horse the rest of the way up. The horse was a bay gelding named Harlan, 7 years old, solid through the chest and calm in the head, with a white blaze that ran crooked down his face like a mistake that had been forgiven. Harlan had been trained by someone patient. He stood when told, moved when asked, and did not spook at shadows. Elias trusted him because trust, like construction, was built through repetition rather than talk. At the top, Elias tied Harlan to a scrubby juniper and unloaded tools. He did not rush. He walked the slope again, marking lines with chalk and small stones, confirming what he had already decided. Water would move fast here, but it would move away. The hill slanted just enough to drain without cutting. The shallow recess he had noticed the day before faced away from the prevailing wind. It was not shelter yet, but it could become one. Elias opened his notebook and began to sketch, keeping the lines simple. He was not designing a house meant to impress. He was designing something that would remain useful when conditions changed. By mid-morning, the sun was high and the wind had arrived. Elias worked through it, setting stakes, measuring distance, checking angles. He did not argue with the hill. He adjusted to it. When his shoulder tightened, he paused and waited until the ache settled into something manageable. He had learned long ago that ignoring pain only turned it into a problem later. Construction had taught him patience, and ranch work had reinforced it. The first interruption came just before noon, announced by the sound of an engine struggling uphill. A dusty pickup stopped below the ridge, and a man climbed out, moving carefully, as if the ground might object. He was in his late 50s, broad through the middle, with a thick gray mustache that drooped over his upper lip and a face permanently set into mild disapproval. His name was Thomas Reed, though most people called him Tom. He owned land in the valley and had lost part of a barn years earlier during an unexpected flash flood. Since then, his caution had hardened into suspicion. Tom climbed the last stretch and stopped a few yards away, hands on his hips. "Didn't think you were serious," he said, voice rough from dust and habit. Elias nodded once. "I was." Tom looked at the stakes, the chalk marks, the pipe sections laid out neatly. "This is a bad place to build," he said, not unkindly, but firmly. "It's a bad place to build quickly," Elias replied. "Not the same thing," Tom snorted. "We don't get enough rain to justify all this." Elias straightened and met his gaze. "We don't get enough rain to practice for it," he said. "That's different." Tom scratched his mustache, eyes narrowing. He was not a foolish man, but he disliked plans that implied he had missed something. "You expecting trouble?" he asked. "I'm expecting weather," Elias said. Tom stood there a moment longer, then shrugged. "It's your time," he said, and turned back toward his truck. He paused before leaving. "Stone holds," he added, almost reluctantly, "but wind will test you." So will water, Elias said. Tom waved without turning around and drove off, leaving the hill to its quiet. The afternoon passed with steady work. Elias dug shallow trenches for drainage, careful not to undercut the slope. He set pipe with deliberate spacing, angling outlets away from where water might pool. It was not dramatic work, but it mattered. He paused often to step back and look, checking that each decision made sense when viewed as part of a whole. By the time the sun dipped low, the outline of the structure was clear enough to imagine. Not a house yet, a commitment. He led Harlan back down as the air cooled. On the way, he passed a young woman walking uphill with a clipboard tucked against her chest. She was in her late 20s, slim and sunburned, with sandy hair pulled into a loose knot that refused to stay neat. Her name was Lina Morales, a county environmental surveyor assigned to the area after a series of minor erosion complaints. She moved with alert efficiency, eyes always scanning ground and slope rather than faces. "Evening," she said, stopping a few feet away. "You're Elias Crow?" "Yes." "I'm Lina Morales," she said, holding up her badge briefly. "I'm mapping runoff patterns. Heard someone was setting stakes up here." Elias nodded. "That's me." She looked past him at the hill, then back at her clipboard. "You planning a permanent structure?" "Yes." "Stone?" "Yes." She considered this. Lips pressed together. "That's smarter than most," she said. "But you'll need to manage runoff carefully. This hill sheds water fast." "That's the idea." She studied the trenches he'd started. "You've done this before." "I used to build," Elias said. Lina nodded, satisfied. "Good. The valley isn't ready for prolonged saturation. If we get a wet season, it's going to be trouble." She hesitated, then added, "No one's predicting that, officially." Elias met her eyes. "Predictions aren't the same as preparation." She smiled slightly. "No, they're not." She made a note on her clipboard. "Just make sure you file permits before you pour anything permanent." "I will." She left him there, walking uphill toward the ridge, already focused on the ground ahead. That night, Elias dreamed again. The rain had not begun yet, but the sky was heavy, waiting. He woke before dawn, rested but alert, the certainty still there, unchanged. He did not try to interpret it. He accepted it as information. Over the next week, Elias worked steadily. He hauled stone, set footing, and began shaping the lower walls. The structure took form slowly, built into the hill rather than placed on it. He angled walls slightly inward for strength and left space for ventilation that would not invite water. He slept lightly and ate simply, his days structured around the work rather than the clock. People came by occasionally, drawn by curiosity more than concern. Some offered advice, some offered warnings. Elias listened to all of it without arguing. He didn't need agreement to proceed. One afternoon, Sarah Ortega drove out to the hill, her truck kicking up dust. She climbed out wearing jeans and a wide-brimmed hat, her braid tucked into her collar. She surveyed the work without comment, eyes sharp. "You weren't exaggerating," she said finally. "You're really doing this." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "I said I would." She walked the perimeter, careful where she stepped. "You're building for something specific," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." She looked at him. "You want to tell anyone?" Elias shook his head. "Not until I can explain it without sounding like I'm guessing." Sarah considered this. "Fair," she said. "People don't like guessing." She glanced at the sky, clear and bright. "They trust what they can see." "That's usually the problem," Elias said. She smiled briefly. "If you need more sealant, order early. Supply chains get strange when weather does." Then she turned back toward her truck. "You're going to be tired," she added. "Don't let that make you careless." "I won't." As the weeks passed, subtle changes began to appear. Clouds lingered longer in the afternoons. The air held moisture it hadn't before. Once, a brief rain fell and did not evaporate immediately. Elias noticed everything. He did not say much. By the end of the month, the foundation was set. The drainage system was complete. The structure was still low, unfinished, but it was stable. Elias stood back and assessed it in the late light. It was not impressive. It did not need to be. That night, The wind picked up after dark, steady and persistent. Elias lay awake, listening, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The hill held. The structure did not shift. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the valley slept, unaware. Elias closed his eyes, knowing the work ahead would be harder, slower, and more visible. But the groundwork was done, and groundwork, he knew, determined everything that followed. The first real change arrived quietly, the way serious things often did in Santa Fe. There was no announcement, no dramatic shift in the sky, only a difference in how the mornings felt. The air no longer cleared itself as quickly after sunrise. It held on to coolness longer than it should have, and by midday, the heat pressed down with a dull, humid weight that did not belong in the high desert. Elias Crow noticed it immediately. He had learned, both as a builder and a ranch hand, that weather rarely surprised the land itself. It surprised people who stopped paying attention. He continued working on the hill every day, extending the stone walls upward, one measured layer at a time. The structure was still low, but its shape was now unmistakable. It leaned slightly into the slope, braced by the hill rather than standing apart from it. Elias mixed mortar carefully, adjusting the ratio to account for temperature changes, knowing that too much moisture trapped inside would weaken everything later. He worked with his sleeves rolled down despite the heat, protecting his arms from the stone and from habits formed long ago on construction sites where a moment of carelessness left scars that never fully faded. Harlan remained patient throughout the work, standing tied nearby, flicking his tail against flies that seemed more numerous than usual. The gelding's coat had grown darker with the season, and his calm demeanor steadied Elias in ways the man never admitted out loud. When Elias paused to stretch his shoulder or step back to evaluate a wall, Harlan waited without complaint, ears rotating lazily toward distant sounds. Horses, Elias had learned, reacted before people did. They felt pressure changes, shifts in scent, the subtle tension in the air. Harlan had begun to snort more often, not in fear but in alertness, as if the world required closer inspection. By the second week, clouds began to gather in the afternoons and linger past sunset. They did not release rain at first. They only stayed, stacked low and gray, flattening the horizon. Elias worked beneath them without looking up more than necessary. He had already accepted that the signs would come slowly. That was how long-term weather announced itself, not with storms, but with persistence. The valley, however, reacted poorly to patience. People grew uneasy. Ranchers complained about damp tack and livestock that refused to settle at night. Gardeners noticed that soil held moisture longer than expected. A few older residents mentioned similar seasons decades earlier, but their comments were dismissed as exaggeration, stories polished by time. Elias heard about these conversations secondhand and did not correct anyone. He understood that belief required more than observation. It required inconvenience. One afternoon, while Elias was reinforcing a corner joint, a truck pulled up near the base of the hill. A man climbed out slowly, leaning on the door for balance. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard streaked with premature gray and a face worn by sun and disappointment. His name was Mark Holloway, a local insurance adjuster whose job had made him cautious to the point of pessimism. Years of inspecting collapsed roofs and flood-damaged foundations had stripped him of optimism but left him practical. Mark climbed carefully, boots slipping slightly on loose gravel, and stopped near the edge of the work area. "Heard you're building something permanent up here," he said, voice low and even. Elias nodded. "That's the plan." Mark surveyed the structure, eyes sharp, noting drainage paths, wall angles, the way the stone met the slope. "You used to build," he said. "Yes." "Smart build," Mark admitted. "Not many people think about runoff until they're filing claims." Elias set his trowel down. "You seeing more of those lately?" Mark exhaled slowly. "More than usual. Nothing catastrophic. Yet. But moisture's doing odd things to older foundations. Insurance doesn't like patterns." "Neither do buildings," Elias replied. Mark gave a short, humorless smile. "If you're wrong, you've wasted time. If you're right, people will say you were lucky." Elias met his gaze. "I'm fine with either." Mark stayed a while longer, asking a few practical questions, then left without offering advice. His presence confirmed what Elias already knew. The system was beginning to notice stress, even if it had not named it yet. That evening, Elias returned to town for supplies and stopped briefly at Ortega Supply. Sarah was closing up, sweeping dust toward the door. She looked tired, a crease forming between her brows that hadn't been there before. "People are buying sealant," she said without preamble. "Lots of it, that's unusual." "They'll need it," Elias said. She leaned on the broom. "You still dreaming?" "Yes." "Still the same?" "Yes." She nodded once, as if that settled something. "Let me know if you need credit," she said. "Weather makes people cautious. Caution makes businesses nervous." "I will." The following night, rain came for the first time. It was light, almost polite, barely enough to darken the dust. It lasted less than an hour and left behind a smell of damp earth that unsettled people more than it pleased them. Elias stood under the partial shelter of the stone recess and watched how the water moved. It slid down the hill exactly as he expected, following channels he had cut, leaving the foundation untouched. The test was small, but it mattered. The rain returned 2 days later, longer this time. Then again the following week. Not storms, not floods, just rain that refused to follow the rules people relied on. Elias adjusted his work schedule, choosing materials carefully, storing supplies where moisture could not reach them. He finished the lower walls and began setting internal support, leaving space for airflow and inspection. He knew from experience that hidden problems were the ones that destroyed structures quietly. Lena Morales returned during one of these overcast afternoons. She climbed the hill briskly, rain jacket tied around her waist, clipboard under one arm. Her expression was focused, professional, but there was tension in her posture that had not been there before. "We're updating runoff models," she said. "This pattern isn't short-term." Elias nodded. "I know." She studied the build again. "You're ahead of most people." "I started early." She hesitated. "You might want to prepare for visitors." "Visitors?" "People who don't know where else to go if things get bad," she said. Elias did not answer immediately. He had not planned for people. He had planned for weather. Still, the structure he was building did not exclude either possibility. "I'll keep working," he said finally. That night, the dream changed. The rain was no longer distant. It was close enough to hear on stone. Elias woke before dawn, the sound still echoing in his head, steady and unrelenting. Outside, the sky was heavy with cloud, and the ground remained damp beneath his boots. He returned to the hill before sunrise, set Harlan in his usual place, and began reinforcing the entrance, not because it was part of the original plan, but because plans, like buildings, required adjustment when conditions changed. As he worked, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain that had traveled a long way to arrive. Elias paused, rested his hand against the stone wall, and felt no movement. The structure held. The hill held. For now, that was enough. He resumed work as the first drops began to fall again, light but certain, knowing that preparation was no longer theoretical. The weather had started to arrive, exactly as the dream had warned, and Elias Crow intended to be ready before anyone else realized how long it planned to stay. Rain no longer announced itself in Santa Fe. It arrived without warning and stayed without apology. What began as scattered showers settled into a pattern that unsettled even those who prided themselves on long memory. Mornings opened under low cloud cover, afternoons closed with damp air clinging to skin and clothing, and nights carried the steady, unbroken sound of water touching earth. It was not heavy rain. It did not flood streets or tear roofs away. It simply continued, long enough for the land to remember something it had not practiced in years. Elias Crow adjusted his routine accordingly. He rose earlier, worked longer stretches between showers, and spent more time inspecting what he had already built than adding new stone. The structure on the red hill had grown into a clear form now, a low, solid dwelling anchored into the slope, its walls thick and deliberate, its entrance angled away from prevailing wind and runoff. It didn't look like a house people expected. It looked like something meant to endure rather than impress. Harlan remained steady despite the change in weather. His bay coat darkened when wet, and the white blaze down his face stood out sharply against the gray sky. He was less patient with standing idle now, shifting his weight and snorting when thunder rolled distantly. Elias noticed the tension in the horse and took it seriously. Animals responded to pressure sooner than people did, and Harlan's unease confirmed what Elias already sensed. The weather was settling in. Down in the valley, the effects became harder to ignore. Dirt roads softened and rutted. Older homes with shallow foundations developed hairline cracks that widened by degrees rather than inches. People patched and sealed and told themselves it was temporary. Elias heard about it in fragments. Conversations at supply stores, comments exchanged at the feedlot, the tightening expressions of men who had built their lives on predictable seasons. One afternoon, as Elias reinforced an internal support beam, voices carried up the hill. He straightened and saw two figures climbing toward the structure. The first was Lena Morales, her rain jacket now worn properly rather than tied around her waist. The second was a man Elias did not recognize. He moved carefully, favoring his right leg, his posture slightly hunched as if shaped by years of physical strain. He was in his late 50s, tall but gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a beard trimmed close to his jaw, streaked with white. His name, Elias would soon learn, was Robert Cal Caldwell. Cal had once been a contractor, not a careful one. Years earlier, a rushed job and ignored drainage warnings had resulted in a partial structural collapse during a heavy spring rain. No one had been killed, but Cal had been injured badly enough to end his career. Since then, caution had hardened into restraint, and restraint into silence. Lena stopped a few yards from Elias and gestured toward Cal. "This is Robert Caldwell," she said. "He's consulting with the county on older structures." Cal nodded once. "Heard you're building into stone," he said. His voice was rough but controlled. "Mind if I look?" "Go ahead," Elias replied. Cal circled the structure slowly, studying joints, tapping stone with his knuckles, testing drainage outlets with his boot. He did not rush. When he finally stopped, he looked at Elias directly. "You're expecting saturation," he said. "Yes." Cal exhaled through his nose. "Most people don't plan for that until after the first failure." "I don't like rebuilding," Elias said. Cal's mouth tightened briefly. "Neither do I." He turned back to Lena. "This one's done right." Lena nodded. "That's what I told them. They won't listen until something gives," Cal added quietly. That evening, the rain intensified. Not dramatically, but enough to change the sound on stone from tapping to sliding. Elias stood under the overhang and watched water move exactly as intended, guided away from the foundation, dispersed without force. Below the hill, the valley darkened, soil absorbing until it could no longer do so quickly. By the third consecutive week of rain, the first real failures appeared. A storage shed near the river tilted and collapsed inward. A retaining wall along a dirt road gave way, spilling mud across the path. Mark Holloway stopped by unannounced one morning, his beard damp, his expression grim. "Claims are coming in," he said. "Nothing major yet, but it's trending wrong." Elias handed him coffee from a thermos. "How long do you think it'll last?" Mark shook his head. "Forecasts keep pushing the end date out." He looked toward the valley. "People aren't ready." "They won't be," Elias said. "Not until it costs them." That night, thunder rolled closer than before. The rain deepened, turning from persistence to pressure. Elias slept lightly, waking often to check walls, supports, drainage flow. The structure did not move. The hill held. Stone did what stone always did. On the fourth night, someone arrived after dark. Elias heard the truck long before he saw it, engine struggling up the softened track. He opened the door to find a woman standing in the rain, soaked and shaking. Her name was Marjorie Wells, early 60s, short and broad-shouldered, with graying hair pulled back hastily and worry etched deeply into her face. She had lived in the valley for 40 years, long enough to believe familiarity was protection. "My basement's flooding," she said, voice tight. "I didn't know where else to go." Elias stepped aside. "Come in." He did not make promises. He didn't explain. He showed her where to sit, gave her a towel, set water to heat. She watched him with a mixture of fear and relief, as if stability itself had become unfamiliar. By morning, 2 more people had arrived, then 3, not refugees yet, just neighbors. Seeking dry ground and reassurance, Elias accommodated them as best he could, adjusting space, reinforcing temporary supports, making sure no one interfered with critical areas of the structure. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask questions that didn't matter. Lena returned the next day, rain dripping from her hood. She took in the scene quietly. "This is starting," she said. "Yes." She hesitated. The county may recommend designated shelter points if this continues. Elias looked around the interior of the stone structure. It was unfinished, but solid. They can recommend whatever they need to, he said. I'll keep building. That night, the dream did not come. Elias slept without images, without warning. When he woke, the rain was still falling, steady and unbroken. The absence of the dream felt heavier than its presence. It meant the future had moved closer to the present. He stood at the entrance, watching water trace the lines he had cut weeks earlier. The ground below shifted slightly, settling rather than collapsing. For now, the hill remembered how to hold. Elias turned back inside, knowing that the work ahead was no longer only about weather. People were beginning to notice where the ground stayed firm. And soon, they would come not out of curiosity, but necessity. The rain did not intensify so much as it settled into its role. Days blurred into one another under a ceiling of cloud that refused to lift, and the sound of water became the town's background noise, as constant as breath. Elias Crow adjusted to it the way he adjusted to everything else, by narrowing his focus and doing what could be done next. He reinforced the interior braces, sealed seams that had never been tested under this much moisture, and rerouted one drainage channel after noticing how water pooled when the wind shifted. The structure on the red hill remained firm, and that firmness began to draw attention that curiosity alone could no longer explain. Marjorie Wells stayed through the night and into the next day. She moved cautiously inside the unfinished space, careful not to step where Elias had marked load-bearing areas with chalk. In better light, she looked older than Elias had first guessed, her face lined deeply from years of sun and worry, her hands strong and square from work that had never been gentle. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with the bluntness of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions without expecting help. Her basement had taken on water twice more since she arrived, she said quietly, and the sump pump no longer kept up. By midday, 2 more people arrived, then another before evening. Elias did not ask for names immediately. He showed them where to sit, where to place wet boots, which wall to avoid leaning against while mortar cured. He kept his voice low and steady, not out of kindness, but efficiency. Panic wasted energy. He did not have energy to spare. The new arrivals varied in temperament. One was Paul Niven, early 40s, lean to the point of gauntness, with a sharp nose and perpetually reddened eyes that suggested too little sleep. He had run a small auto repair shop in the valley until standing water reached the electrical panels. Years of fixing other people's problems had left him impatient with uncertainty, and he paced more than necessary, asking the same questions in different ways. Another was Teresa Alvarez, late 50s, compact and strong, her gray-streaked hair cut short for convenience. She had worked as a school aide for decades and carried herself with the calm authority of someone used to managing chaos in small doses. Teresa noticed details, offered help without asking, and kept Paul from spiraling by redirecting him toward useful tasks. Elias assigned work when it made sense, not busy work, but tasks that mattered, stacking stone where it would be needed later, checking the drainage outlets during heavy rainfall, keeping the interior clear. He didn't frame it as leadership, he framed it as necessity. People responded better to that. By the 3rd day, the county made its first formal appearance. A white SUV climbed the hill and stopped short of the worksite, its tires slipping slightly in softened gravel. A man stepped out, careful and deliberate, smoothing his jacket against the rain. His name was Daniel Kessler, mid-30s, county emergency coordinator, clean-shaven with hair cut too precisely for the conditions. He had the look of someone who had spent years in meetings and only recently been asked to step into the weather itself. Kessler introduced himself, glanced at the gathering of people, and asked practical questions. Elias answered without embellishment. Yes, the structure was stable. Yes, it was unfinished. Yes, he understood the risks. Kessler nodded, taking notes, eyes moving constantly. We're identifying temporary shelter options, he said. Schools, community centers, this location wasn't on our list. It's not finished, Elias said. But it's dry, Kessler replied, and elevated. Yes. Kessler hesitated, then said, we may recommend this as a short-term refuge if conditions worsen. Elias did not argue. If people come, I'll manage the load, he said. I won't compromise the structure. That's reasonable, Kessler said, relief evident. He paused before leaving. You planning to stay here? Yes. Good, Kessler said. Stability matters. The rain continued. It soaked clothing, softened tempers, and tested patience in small, cumulative ways. Elias noticed how quickly small irritations grew when people were tired and wet. He addressed them directly, not with speeches but with adjustments. He created clear spaces, designated quiet areas, and established simple routines. Water here, tools there, do not move this. Ask before touching that. The clarity helped. It always did. Harlan remained tied near the juniper, sheltered as best Elias could manage. The horse tolerated the rain with resignation, head lowered, ears flicking. Elias checked him often, rubbed down his neck, spoke softly. Harlan's presence grounded Elias in a way nothing else did. Animals did not care about plans. They cared about the present moment, and the present moment still held. Late one evening, as rain hammered steadily against stone, a truck arrived carrying 2 men and a woman. They moved quickly, coordinated by urgency rather than fear. The woman introduced herself as Claire Morton, early 50s, tall and spare, her hair pulled back tightly, her face pale with fatigue. She managed a small assisted living facility near the river. The men with her were brothers, Miguel and Aaron Reyes, both in their 30s, broad-shouldered and quiet, their beards trimmed short. They had come to ask, not demand. Our lower floor is flooding, Claire said. We've moved residents upstairs, but access is getting difficult. We need somewhere dry if this keeps up. Elias listened, asked how many, asked about mobility. He thought through load limits, airflow, space. He did not promise more than he could deliver. Bring the most vulnerable first, he said. We'll make room. That night marked the shift from precaution to response. The next day, the first elderly residents arrived, escorted carefully, their faces tight with confusion and trust. Elias adjusted again. He cleared a wider area, reinforced temporary supports, redirected foot traffic. Teresa helped immediately, speaking gently, organizing blankets. Paul found purpose checking tools and securing equipment. Marjorie sat with one of the older women and spoke quietly, her blunt manner softened by circumstance. The structure held, the hill held, but the weight increased, not just physical, but human. Elias felt it in his shoulders, in the careful calculations he ran constantly. He slept less, listened more. The dream did not return. Reality had replaced it. Mark Holloway returned, his truck splattered with mud. Claims are exploding, he said. Some places are inaccessible now. How long? Elias asked. Mark shrugged. No one's saying. Forecast models keep shifting. That uncertainty settled over the group like the rain itself. Elias addressed it directly. We work with what we have, he said. We don't wait for certainty. People nodded. They wanted instruction, not reassurance. One night, long after most had settled, Elias stepped outside under the overhang. The rain slid down stone, controlled, purposeful. He thought of the valley below, of foundations failing quietly, of assumptions giving way. He did not feel vindicated. He felt tired and responsible. The next morning, Daniel Kessler returned with supplies and a formal notice designating the hill structure as an auxiliary shelter. Elias read it, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Labels did not change physics. Work did. As the day wore on, the rain eased slightly, then resumed. No one celebrated. They had learned better. Elias stood at the entrance as evening fell, watching people move inside with less urgency than before. They were adapting. He took that as a sign of progress. The structure had become something more than preparation. It had become proof. He returned to his workbench and adjusted a support brace, tightening it a fraction. The stone did not shift. The hill did not protest. For now, staying dry was enough. By the time the rain reached its 6th straight week, people stopped asking when it would end. The question no longer served a purpose. What mattered now was whether the ground would hold, whether walls would stay upright, whether the places meant to protect people could still be trusted. Elias Crow felt the shift not in the weather itself, but in how people moved. They walked more carefully, spoke more quietly, and waited for instruction instead of reassurance. That, more than any forecast, told him the situation had crossed a threshold. The structure on the Red Hill had changed again. It was no longer simply a shelter or a construction project. It had become a system under load. Elias treated it the same way he would have treated a bridge or a warehouse under stress. He monitored traffic flow, adjusted interior supports, limited access to unfinished sections, and kept strict count of how many people occupied each area. He explained little. He posted clear rules and enforced them evenly. People accepted this because consistency mattered more than comfort now. Harlan remained outside under the juniper, where Elias had reinforced a temporary windbreak using spare boards and canvas. The horse's patience was wearing thin. His coat stayed damp despite regular brushing, and his movements had grown restless. Elias checked him frequently, massaging stiff muscles, feeding him smaller portions more often to keep his strength up. He spoke to Harlan quietly, not because he expected understanding, but because routine calmed them both. The animal had carried him through worse conditions than this, and Elias trusted him to endure a little longer. Inside the structure, the population grew slowly but steadily. Some came for a few hours and left when the rain eased. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go. The elderly residents from Claire Morton's facility settled into a predictable rhythm, sleeping, eating, and resting in the same areas. Teresa Alvarez managed them naturally, her calm presence preventing small frustrations from becoming problems. Paul Niven remained anxious but useful, channeling his energy into maintenance tasks that Elias assigned deliberately to keep him focused. Late one afternoon, a new arrival appeared alone, walking rather than driving. He came up the hill on foot through steady rain, shoulders hunched against the wind, coat soaked through. He was in his late 30s, tall but narrow, with sharp features and a heavy beard that clung wetly to his jaw. His name was Owen Pike. He had once worked as a surveyor for a private firm, but had left the job after a landslide killed a coworker during a rushed assessment. Since then, he trusted data less than experience and kept his distance from authority. Owen did not ask for shelter immediately. He stood near the entrance, watching how people moved, how Elias spoke, how the structure responded to the weather. When Elias approached, Owen said simply, "Your drainage is working." "Yes," Elias replied. "I walked 3 miles through mud to see if it would," Owen said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were alert, measuring. "The valley's starting to shear in places, shallow slides, nothing dramatic yet." Elias nodded. "It will get worse before it gets better." "That's what I think," Owen said. "I can help you monitor the slope if you want." Elias considered him briefly. "You follow instructions?" Owen's mouth twitched. "I follow reality." "That'll do," Elias said. Owen proved useful immediately. He marked stress points on the hill where runoff increased, identified areas where the soil beneath stone shelves might weaken if the rain continued another month. He worked quietly, efficiently, and did not interfere with Elias's authority. The two men did not become friendly, but they respected each other's competence, which mattered more. The real test came 2 nights later. The rain intensified again, not suddenly, but with a deeper pressure. Wind pushed water sideways, forcing it against surfaces that had not been designed to meet it. Elias moved through the structure with a lantern, checking joints, listening for unfamiliar sounds. He felt it first under his boots, a subtle vibration, almost like a sigh traveling through stone. Outside, part of the lower valley gave way. The sound reached the hill seconds later, a distant, heavy collapse, followed by shouting carried thinly through rain. Elias froze only long enough to identify the direction. He turned back inside and began issuing instructions. Teresa began waking the elderly residents. Paul secured loose equipment. Owen grabbed his gear and headed for the outer supports to monitor movement. Minutes later, headlights appeared on the lower slope. Vehicles struggled upward, engines revving against mud. People arrived soaked, shaking, some injured but moving. Elias controlled entry strictly, directing them to specific areas, refusing access to spaces that could not take additional load. His voice remained level. He did not apologize. Among the arrivals was a man named Victor Hale, early 40s, broad and heavy-set, with a thick beard and a face flushed from exertion and fear. Victor had owned a small landscaping business and prided himself on physical strength. When his retaining wall failed, he had tried to shore it up himself instead of evacuating. The effort had strained his back badly, and now he moved stiffly, anger and pain mixing in his expression. "You've got room," Victor said, pushing toward an interior wall. "Not there," Elias said, stepping in front of him. "That section's curing." Victor bristled. "People are hurt out there." "So will more be if this wall fails," Elias replied. He didn't raise his voice. Owen stepped in beside Elias, his presence quiet but firm. Victor hesitated, then backed off. He sat heavily where directed, muttering under his breath. Later, after pain medication and rest, dulled his edge, he apologized without making a show of it. Elias accepted it without comment. By morning, the extent of the damage became clearer. Several homes near the river were lost completely. Roads were impassable. Emergency services struggled to reach isolated areas. Daniel Kessler returned with additional supplies and grim updates. "We're rerouting resources," he said. "This site is now one of the few stable points." Elias listened, then asked one question. "How many more?" Kessler hesitated. "Hard to say." "Give me a range." 20 to 40, Kessler said. Elias calculated silently. "I can take 25, he said. "More than that compromises safety." Kessler nodded. "I'll divert the rest." That night, Elias barely slept. He moved constantly, adjusting supports, monitoring stress points, coordinating with Owen to track slope movement. The structure creaked occasionally, but it did not shift. Stone carried the load the way it was meant to, distributing pressure rather than resisting it. Just before dawn, the rain softened, not stopped, softened. The sound on stone changed from force to persistence. Elias stood at the entrance, watching the hill shed water in controlled lines, the drainage channels working exactly as designed. Below, the valley lay broken and dark. Owen joined him, rain dripping from his beard. "You built for this," he said. "I built for the possibility," Elias replied. Owen nodded. "Most people don't." Inside, people slept wherever exhaustion allowed. Teresa sat quietly with the elderly. Paul dozed, sitting upright. Victor lay flat, breathing evenly at last. Harlan stood outside, head lowered, patient again. Elias leaned against the stone wall and closed his eyes for a moment. The dream did not return. It was no longer needed. The future had arrived, and it was heavy. But the structure held, the hill held, and for the first time since the rain began, Elias allowed himself to believe that holding might be enough. The rain eased after dawn, but no one mistook it for mercy. It thinned, softened, and then returned with the same stubborn rhythm that had defined the past weeks. The valley below the red hill looked changed in a way that felt permanent. What had once been open ground now lay uneven and scarred, as if the land itself had shifted position during the night and refused to explain why. Elias Crow stood at the entrance of the structure and studied the slope in silence, noting where runoff had cut deeper channels and where the earth had compacted instead of sliding. The hill had held, but it had remembered the weight placed upon it. Inside, the shelter moved differently now. People no longer drifted through with uncertainty. They had settled into patterns shaped by fatigue and necessity. Spaces were claimed, routines established, voices lowered by shared understanding rather than instruction. Elias noticed it the way a builder noticed when a structure stopped settling and began to stabilize. This was no longer a temporary gathering. It was a system learning its limits. Harlan stood quietly outside, steam lifting from his coat in the cool morning air. The bay gelding looked thinner, his ribs just visible beneath damp hair, but his eyes were steady. Elias brushed him slowly, checking for sores, feeding him carefully rationed grain. The horse leaned into the contact, patient as ever. Elias trusted that patience. It had been earned through consistency, not comfort. By mid-morning, Daniel Kessler returned with news that shifted the atmosphere immediately. He climbed the hill without his usual caution, jacket streaked with mud, face drawn tight. "We've lost 2 access roads entirely," he said once inside. "Emergency crews can't reach several pockets in the valley. We're prioritizing evacuation uphill." "How many?" Elias asked. "Hard to say," Kessler replied, "but more than we planned for." Elias did the math quickly. The structure was near its safe capacity. He had reinforced where possible, redistributed weight, but physics did not bend for good intentions. "I can stretch a little," he said. "Not much," Kessler nodded. "I'll send only those who can't stay where they are." That promise was tested before noon. The first group arrived on foot, soaked and exhausted, led by Owen Pike, who had gone out at first light to check a reported slide. With him was a young man Elias did not recognize, limping badly, his left leg wrapped in a makeshift brace. The man's name was Jonah Brooks, 22, thin and pale, with dark curls plastered to his forehead and hands that shook from shock rather than cold. He had been helping his parents reinforce their home when the ground gave way beneath a retaining wall, crushing his leg against concrete. Elias directed them inside immediately. He examined Jonah's injury carefully, his movements precise. The break was clean, but painful. They stabilized the leg and positioned Jonah where he could rest without causing obstruction. Teresa stayed with him, calm and reassuring, her presence steadying the room. More people followed as the day wore on. Among them was Eleanor Price, early 70s, tall despite age, with silver hair pulled back tightly and a posture that suggested discipline rather than frailty. She had been a school principal for decades before retiring, and the habit of authority had never left her. She asked direct questions, offered help without being prompted, and kept the younger arrivals focused when panic threatened to take hold. Elias welcomed the assistance. Leadership did not mean control. It meant delegation to those who understood responsibility. The rain intensified again in the afternoon, driven sideways by wind. The structure absorbed the sound, but the pressure outside was unmistakable. Owen and Elias monitored the supports closely, marking areas where water flow increased unexpectedly. Owen's experience with slope failure proved invaluable. He moved with careful efficiency, checking stress points and reporting changes without dramatizing them. Late in the day, an argument broke out near the entrance. Victor Hale, still stiff from his injury, had grown restless. He insisted on leaving to check his property, convinced he could salvage equipment before it was lost entirely. His voice rose, frustration breaking through exhaustion. "I can't just sit here while everything I own washes away," he said. Elias met him at eye level. "If you leave now, you won't make it back," he said evenly. "The roads aren't roads anymore." Victor clenched his jaw. "You don't know that." "I do," Elias replied, "because I've been watching the ground, not the sky." The words landed harder than Elias intended, but they were true. Victor looked away, shoulders sagging slightly. He sat back down without another word. Later, he apologized again, this time quietly, and Elias accepted it with a nod. Crisis stripped people down to essentials. Pride was rarely one of them for long. Night fell early beneath the clouds. Lanterns cast steady pools of light across stone walls darkened by moisture but unmoving. The sound of rain grew heavier, and then, without warning, the power in the valley went out entirely. Darkness swallowed the lower ground, leaving only scattered headlights and the distant glow of emergency vehicles struggling to reposition. Inside the shelter, the loss of power changed little. Elias had prepared for it. Lanterns were lit, batteries were rationed. The structure did not rely on electricity to remain safe. Still, the psychological weight of darkness pressed in. People grew quiet, listening to the rain and to each other's breathing. Around midnight, a deep rumble rolled through the ground. Not a crash, but a shifting, resonant sound that traveled upward through stone and into bone. Elias felt it through the soles of his boots. He froze, listening. Owen looked up sharply. "That was a slide," he said. "Big one." They moved quickly, checking the perimeter. Water rushed down the hill in controlled streams, heavier than before but still guided. The structure held, but the valley below was taking the full force of the collapse. Shouts echoed faintly from below, swallowed by rain. Within minutes, headlights appeared again, climbing the slope. More people, fewer belongings. Elias directed them inside, his voice calm but firm. He refused entry to areas that could not take additional load, even when faced with pleading. It was the hardest thing he had done since the rain began, but compromise now would endanger everyone. By the time the last arrivals were settled, the shelter was at maximum safe capacity. Elias posted himself near the entrance, refusing further access. Daniel Kessler arrived shortly after, soaked and grim. "We'll redirect the rest," he said. "You've done all you can here." Elias nodded. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind remained clear. The structure creaked once, softly, then stilled. Stone accepted the weight, distributing it as designed. As dawn approached, the rain finally began to thin. It did not stop, but the pressure eased. The longest night ended not with celebration, but with quiet relief. People slept where they sat, drained beyond conversation. Teresa rested her head against the wall, eyes closed. Eleanor Price sat upright, hands folded, watching the light change. Elias stepped outside just as the sky lightened slightly. The hill glistened with water but stood firm. The channels he had cut weeks earlier guided the last heavy flows safely away. Below, the valley lay scarred and broken, but the sounds of life continued. Voices, engines, movement. Owen joined him, rain dripping from his beard. "You set a limit," he said. "Most people wouldn't." "They don't build things that have to hold," Elias replied. Owen nodded. "They will remember this." Elias did not answer. Memory was not his concern. Stability was. He returned inside and made another round, checking supports, checking people, checking Harlan one more time before tying the windbreak tighter. The rain continued to ease, minute by minute. The structure had survived its greatest test yet. The longest night had passed. What came next would be rebuilding, assessment, decisions that could not be rushed. Elias leaned against the stone wall and allowed himself one slow breath. The hill had held, the shelter had held, and so had he. The rain didn't stop all at once. It loosened its grip the way a stubborn hand does, slowly, reluctantly, testing whether anyone would notice its retreat. By mid-morning, the sky lifted just enough to show lighter cloud above darker layers, and the sound on stone changed from force to persistence, then to a thinner, steadier patter that suggested an end was possible. Elias Crow watched the shift from the entrance, not hopeful, simply attentive. Endings, like beginnings, announced themselves quietly when they were real. Inside the shelter, people began to wake with the cautious movements of those who had slept poorly but survived. Lanterns were extinguished one by one. Blankets were folded. Teresa Alvarez moved among the elderly residents with practiced efficiency, checking hands for warmth, faces for color, speaking softly without using false cheer. Eleanor Price coordinated breakfast with the authority of habit, assigning simple tasks that restored a sense of order without demanding energy people did not have. Paul Niven brewed coffee in careful batches, measuring grounds as if precision alone could steady his nerves. Victor Hale stretched his injured back slowly, grimacing but silent, his earlier impatience replaced by a subdued gratitude he did not try to disguise. Elias did not call a meeting. He never had. Instead, he posted a simple list near the entrance, checks to run, areas to avoid, times to rest. The list was practical and unadorned. People followed it because it worked. Stability did not require ceremony. Outside, the hill glistened. Drainage channels carried the last heavy flows safely away, and where water pooled, it did so without pressure, settling rather than cutting. Owen Pike walked the perimeter with Elias, marking minor adjustments with chalk. Owen's beard had dried into a stiff, uneven line, and his eyes were ringed with fatigue, but his voice remained level. "The worst shear has passed," he said. "There'll be cleanup, but the slope's stabilizing." "That's what I hoped," Elias replied. They paused at a point where runoff had tested a retaining line. The stone had held, but the soil beyond it had compacted noticeably. Owen crouched, pressed his palm to the ground, and nodded. "You chose well," he said. "Stone remembers how to stay put." Below them, movement returned to the valley in careful increments. Emergency vehicles repositioned. People emerged from temporary shelters to assess what remained of their homes. The landscape looked altered but not erased. That distinction mattered. By noon, Daniel Kessler arrived with updated information and a new tone. The tension that had sharpened his voice in previous days had eased into something closer to relief. "Evacuations are winding down," he said. "We're shifting to assessment and recovery." Elias listened, then asked, "Any more coming up here?" "No," Kessler said. "Not unless something changes." Elias nodded. He posted a revised capacity notice and began planning the transition. Shelters, he knew, could not remain shelters forever. People needed to leave when it was safe, or safety would turn into dependence. The first to depart were those with places to return to. Teresa escorted the elderly residents back to Claire Morton's facility once access improved, ensuring transportation and continuity of care. Claire thanked Elias without exaggeration, her voice steady despite exhaustion. "You gave us time," she said. "That's what we needed." Jonah Brooks was transported to a clinic once roads reopened enough for safe passage. Before leaving, he thanked Elias awkwardly, embarrassed by the attention. Elias shook his hand gently and reminded him to rest. "Healing takes longer than storms," he said, and Jonah nodded, as if that sentence explained more than Elias intended. Marjorie Wells left next, returning to a house that would need work but still stood. She paused at the entrance, raincoat folded over her arm, eyes fixed on the stone walls. "I didn't think I'd say this," she said, "but I slept better here than I have in weeks." Elias accepted the statement without comment. Sleep was a practical measure of success. As the population thinned, the structure seemed to breathe again. Elias took advantage of the reduced load to inspect everything thoroughly. He repaired small cracks, reinforced a joint that had creaked once under pressure, replaced a worn seal. These were not signs of failure, they were evidence of use. Buildings, like people, showed wear when they did their job. Harlan, finally dry for the first time in days, shook himself vigorously and leaned into Elias's hands when brushed. The gelding's appetite returned, and his posture relaxed, head lifting with renewed interest in the world. Elias smiled briefly. The horse had been a constant through the storm, a living measure of endurance. He deserved a quieter day. In the afternoon, Sarah Ortega drove up the hill, her truck cleaner than it had been in weeks, the rain finally losing its hold on dust. She stepped out wearing work boots and a jacket with the Ortega Supply logo faded nearly beyond recognition. She surveyed the structure slowly, eyes taking in the details. "You built something people relied on," she said. It was not praise. It was observation. Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "I built for water." Sarah nodded. "People came with it." She hesitated, then added, "There's talk in town about changing how we build, about stone, about elevation." "That's sensible," Elias said. "It took a lot for people to learn it," she replied. Later, Owen prepared to leave as well. He packed his gear without ceremony, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to leaving sights behind. Before going, he stood with Elias near the entrance. "You'll keep this place," he said. "Yes. People will come back," Owen said. "Not in a crisis, just to look," Elias shrugged. "Looking doesn't hurt anything." Owen smiled faintly. "Sometimes it does, but this?" He gestured to the hill, the structure, the channels carved with care. "This can handle attention." As evening settled, the sky finally broke. A pale band of light appeared near the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, shadows behaved normally. The rain thinned to a mist and then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was unfamiliar, heavy with expectation. Elias stood still and listened. No water, no wind, just the ordinary sounds of a land learning itself again. Over the next days, recovery took shape. Roads reopened, crews worked steadily, homes were repaired or dismantled safely. Elias helped where he could, lending tools, advice, and time. He refused offers of payment, accepting only materials he needed to finish the structure properly. The hill remained a reference point, a place people checked against when deciding what was safe. One morning, Eleanor Price returned alone. She walked up the hill with a measured pace, posture straight despite her years. She carried a small notebook and a pen. "I've been asked to document what worked," she said, "for the town." Elias considered this, then nodded. "Write it plainly," he said. "No heroics." She smiled. "That's usually my preference." As the final repairs were completed, the structure took on its finished form. It was still modest, still grounded, still built to endure rather than impress. Elias stood back and assessed it with the same critical eye he had used since the first stake was set. It met his standards. That was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the stone in warm light, Elias sat at the entrance with Harlan nearby, the horse's head resting comfortably near his shoulder. The valley below looked different now, not broken, but changed. People moved with new caution, foundations were reconsidered, assumptions were questioned. Elias thought of the dream that had started everything. It did not return. It did not need to. Its work was done. He stood, rested a hand against the stone wall, and felt its steady coolness. The rain had passed. The water had tested everything it touched. What remained had earned its place. Tomorrow would bring planning, rebuilding, decisions shaped by memory rather than fear. Elias welcomed that. He had built for the long term, not the spectacle of survival. The hill stood, the structure stood, and the town, wiser now, would stand with them. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive quietly. through preparation, patience, and the courage to listen when others ignore the warning. Maybe that was not just Elias's strength. Maybe it was God's whisper, reminding him to build on solid ground, not only with stone, but with faith. In our own lives, we don't always see the storm coming. We keep going, trusting that tomorrow will look like yesterday. But faith is not about predicting the future. Faith is about preparing with love, standing firm when the ground shifts, and opening the door when others need shelter. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you. Your words may be the encouragement someone else is praying for. And if you believe, as we do, that no one should face fear alone, especially children, the vulnerable, or those who feel forgotten, please subscribe to this channel and join our growing family. May God bless you, protect your home, steady your steps, and give you strength in every storm you face. Wherever you are watching from tonight, may peace find you, and may you never forget, even the quiet miracles matter. Amen.